It seems like every day there's a new article about some hot new startup that's disrupting this or disrupting that. But, it's often the big established names, the companies that have been around forever, that face the most interesting challenges.
Yeah, for sure.
Like take Intel. For decades, Intel was like the American chip company.
Right.
And now they've got a new CEO, Lip-Bu,
Yeah.
and from what I've been reading, it sounds like he's planning some pretty big changes.
He is. It's a fascinating time for Intel right now. This deep dive is all about that, trying to make sense of this pivotal moment for them. We're going to be looking at a recent report from Reuters that goes into quite a bit of detail about the strategy TAN is expected to take.
Okay, so what's the main takeaway here for our listeners? Should they be worried about Intel? Are they going to be okay?
Well, I think that's what we're here to unpack, right?
Exactly.
We're going to explore these proposed changes and try to understand why a company like Intel is even in this position in the first place.
Yeah, like how do they get here?
Right. And maybe more importantly, what do these changes mean? Not just for Intel, but for the whole tech landscape. What are the ripple effects here?
Yeah, because we all use technology.
Yeah.
Right? So this stuff matters.
It really does. Okay, so to kick things off, I think we need to take a hard look at Intel's recent performance because that really sets the stage for why these changes are happening now.
Yeah, I was reading that in 2024, they reported a $19 billion annual loss. Like, that's a huge number.
It's a staggering figure.
And their first loss since 1986. That really tells you something.
It does. It really underscores how serious the situation is. That's not just a dip in profits. That's a major financial hit.
It's like Dell's entire annual revenue just gone for Intel.
Exactly. It really puts it into perspective. When you see a giant like Intel facing that kind of loss, something's got to change.
For sure. So what happened? Like, how did they get into this situation?
Well, the Reuters report points to a couple of major missteps. One of the biggest ones that people talk about is that they just didn't really capitalize on the smartphone revolution.
Oh, yeah, they were pretty late to that party, weren't they?
They were. And that allowed companies like ARM to really establish themselves as the go-to chip designer for mobile devices.
Right, because ARM chips are really good for low-power devices, like your phone or your tablet.
Exactly. And Intel's traditional focus was on high-performance computing, those big, powerful chips that use a lot of energy.
So they weren't really built for that mobile world?
Not initially, no. And then more recently, you've got the explosion of AI. And again, Intel wasn't quite ready for that.
And NVIDIA was all over it.
They really were. Their GPUs were already well-suited for the kind of parallel processing that AI requires. And they had that CUDA software ecosystem that gave them a big advantage.
So Intel fell behind in those two huge growth areas, smartphones and AI.
That's right. And the report also touches on something interesting. It quotes a semiconductor expert, Dylan Patel, who suggests that the previous CEO, Pat Gelsinger, might have been a little too hesitant to make tough decisions.
Too nice.
Yeah, too nice. Maybe a bit reluctant to shake things up, particularly when it came to middle management.
Interesting. So maybe the company became a bit too bureaucratic.
It's possible.
Yeah.
And now they need someone who's willing to make those difficult choices, someone who can streamline things and make the company more agile.
And that's where Lip-Bu comes in.
Right. So for those who might not know, Tan has a really impressive background in the tech industry.
Yeah, he's not some random guy off the street.
No, not at all. He was the CEO of Cadence Design Systems for many years.
That's a big deal, right? Cadence makes software for designing chips.
Absolutely. Essential software for the whole semiconductor industry. And Tan's also a very successful tech investor. He's got a deep understanding of the business.
So he knows what he's doing.
Right. And here's the interesting thing. He was actually on Intel's board until just last August.
So he was already familiar with the company.
Very familiar. He had an inside view, and then he steps down from the board, and boom, he's back as CEO just a few months later.
That's got to be a sign that they needed a change, and they needed it fast.
It certainly seems that way. And at a town hall meeting after his appointment, he basically told the employees, get ready for some tough decisions.
So he's not messing around.
No, he's not. And it's not just based on his experience on the board. The report says that in late 2023, he took on a special role overseeing Intel's manufacturing process.
So he was already down in the trenches seeing how things worked.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And apparently he wasn't too happy with what he saw.
What was the problem?
Well, sources told Reuters that he was pretty frustrated with the company's culture. He felt like they'd lost that edge, that only the paranoid survive mentality that Andy Grove was famous for.
Yeah, that was Intel's mantra for a long time.
It was.
Yeah.
And Tan felt like they'd become complacent, a bit slow-moving.
So he wants to shake things up, get them back to that hungry innovator mindset.
That's the idea. So let's talk about what he's actually planning to do. The Reuters report highlights several key areas of focus.
Get laid on me.
Right at the top of the list is manufacturing, which makes sense because that's Intel's bread and butter.
Yeah, they're known for their fabs, those giant factories where they make the chips.
Exactly. Now, under the previous CEO, Pat Gelsinger, Intel had this ambitious plan to become a major contract chip manufacturer.
They wanted to be like TSMC, the biggest chip maker in the world.
Exactly. They were going to make chips not just for themselves, but for other companies, too. They invested billions in new factories.
It was a bold move.
It was. But then demand for Intel's own CPUs started to cool off.
So they had to scale back those plans.
Yeah, those massive foundry expansion plans had to be adjusted. So now Tan is coming in, and he's not abandoning the foundry idea entirely, but he's definitely refining the strategy.
So what's the new plan?
Revamping manufacturing is still a top priority, but the focus seems to be on getting new customers for the foundry, more aggressively going after those contracts.
So who are they targeting?
Well, the report mentions Microsoft and Amazon as existing clients. They already use Intel Foundry. So the idea is to solidify those relationships and then bring in even more external business.
But it's not just about getting the contract signed, right? They have to be able to deliver.
Exactly. And apparently that's been a bit of a challenge for Intel Foundry in the past.
What do you mean?
Well, it seems like they haven't always been able to match the level of customer service and technical support that TSMC provides.
So they've had some issues with delays and stuff like that.
Yeah, there have been reports of delays and even failed test runs for potential clients. So if Intel wants to be a real player in the foundry business, they have to step up their game.
They have to prove that they can deliver on time and on spec.
Exactly. They have to build that trust with customers.
Yeah.
But here's the interesting thing. The report does mention that Intel has made some progress recently on the manufacturing side.
Really?
Yeah, they've reportedly improved their fabrication processes, and they've even gotten some big names interested in testing out their technology.
Like who?
Well, NVIDIA and Broadcom have reportedly done some early test runs, and even AMD is said to be evaluating Intel's capabilities.
Wow, so maybe things are starting to turn around.
It's possible. And Tan seems determined to capitalize on this momentum. In his internal memo, he reportedly set a goal of making Intel a world-class foundry.
Ambitious.
It is. And he specifically mentioned wanting to land at least 2 major high-volume customers for the foundry.
That would be a huge win.
It would really show that they're back in the game.
So manufacturing is one big piece of the puzzle. What about AI? That's another area where Intel has some catching up to do.
Absolutely. And the report makes it clear that restarting their AI efforts is a major priority.
What does that mean in practice?
Well, for one thing, they're going to be putting a lot more resources into developing AI chips specifically designed for servers.
That makes sense because those are the workhorses of the AI world, right?
Exactly. But they're not stopping there. The report suggests that they're also looking at AI more broadly. You know, how can they incorporate AI into their software, into robotics, even into developing AI models themselves?
They're trying to become an AI company across the board.
That seems to be the goal. But the report also injects a bit of realism into the timeline. They say that while the long-term goal is to release new AI chips every year like NVIDIA does, developing a truly competitive AI chip architecture could take several years.
So we might not see a game changer from Intel in the AI space until like 2027.
That's the suggestion. But hey, Rome wasn't built in a day.
Right. Okay, so we've got manufacturing, we've got AI. What about the people side of things? The organizational structure in the workforce?
Yeah, that's another area that Tan is focusing on. The report specifically mentions his concern about bloated middle management.
Too many layers of bureaucracy.
Exactly, and he feels like that's slowing down decision-making. So it sounds like some organizational restructuring is on the horizon.
Streamlining things to make the company more efficient.
Right, and the report even says that he's going to be taking a fresh look at the workforce.
Even after they already cut like 15,000 jobs last year.
That's right. So yeah, more job cuts are definitely a possibility.
So it sounds like a lot of changes are coming to Intel, but what about the near term? What are Tan's immediate priorities?
The report highlights 2 key things. First, they have to improve the performance of Intel Foundry. That means getting those manufacturing processes really humming and winning over those big, high-volume customers.
So basically proving that they can compete with TSMC.
Exactly. And the second big priority is the launch of their next-generation chip codenamed Panther Lake.
What's so special about Panther Lake?
Well, it's got some new AI features built in, and it's going to be manufactured using Intel's own 18A technology. So it's kind of a make-or-break product for them.
If it's a hit, it shows that their design and manufacturing capabilities are back on track.
Exactly. So a lot is riding on Panther Lake.
Okay, so Stepping back a bit, is all of this a complete departure from what Gelsinger was doing, or is Tan more like fine-tuning the existing strategy?
I think it's more of a course correction. Gelsinger had this grand vision of turning Intel into a contract chip-making giant, and Tan seems to be keeping that basic goal.
But with a more realistic and maybe more focused approach.
Exactly. He's emphasizing execution, winning over customers, fixing those internal problems.
And he's also said that he wants to spend time listening to customers, partners, and employees.
Right. So maybe a more collaborative approach, less top-down.
Interesting. Okay, so for those of you listening who just tuned in, what are the key takeaways here? What's the big picture?
Well, Intel is going through a major transformation under its new CEO, Lip-Bu Tan. They're overhauling their chip manufacturing operations, trying to become a major player in the foundry business.
And they're really pushing into AI, trying to catch up to NVIDIA and become a leader in that space.
Right. And they're likely going to be restructuring the company, streamlining things, making it more efficient.
And these changes are happening because they had a pretty rough year financially.
Yeah, that $19 billion loss was a real wake-up call.
So the stakes are high for Intel and for the whole semiconductor industry.
Absolutely. This is a critical moment for them.
And it makes you think about all those other big companies that have been around for a long time.
Like, who?
Like, IBM, Microsoft, all those companies that used to be the undisputed leaders.
Right.
Are they going to be able to adapt to this rapidly changing tech landscape?
It's a good question because the world is moving so fast now. And if you're not innovating, if you're not constantly pushing the boundaries, you're going to get left behind.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And Intel's story is a reminder that even the biggest companies aren't immune to that.
For sure.
So what do you think? Who's going to be the next Intel? What other seemingly untouchable giant is going to have to make some drastic changes just to stay relevant?
That's a great question for our listeners to ponder.
Yeah, it's something to think about because the tech world is full of surprises, and who knows what the future holds.
Indeed. It's going to be an interesting ride for sure.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into Intel's future. We'll be back next week with another fascinating look at the tech world.
See you then.